So video number one was a deep dive into individualism versus collectivism. This video is going to be doing a much broader survey of several different dimensions that collectively determine the overall personality or flavor, so to speak, of a culture. So it might not initially be obvious that cultures can even be distinguished along a small set of dimensions. If you think about it, if you're thinking about certain kinds of culture, things like the food of a place, customs and gestures, rituals, or the arts and music of a country, then you might conclude that cultures differ in basically an infinite number of ways. But when we instead talk about psychology, rather than material culture or artistic culture, it's useful to remember that human beings everywhere have had to deal with the same basic challenges and questions. Things like how to eat, how to stay safe and have a roof over your head, how to work effectively with members of your group, how to navigate status hierarchies, or maintain intimate relationships, or raise healthy children. And this idea that there's these really universal challenges and motives leads to the possibility that psychological variation across cultures is in large part about how they solve these basic universal problems. And this idea is encapsulated by this quote from a guy named Clyde Cloghorn. He's a psychologist, and he says, in principle, there's a generalized framework that underlies the more apparent and striking facts of cultural relativity. All cultures constitute just so many distinct answers to essentially the same questions posed by human biology and by the generalities of the human situation. So today we're going to be learning about a framework of cultural dimensions that takes the same basic approach, that assumes that there are, universal features, universal issues that people have to deal with, and cultures should reflect that. This framework asks, what are the main ways that cultures vary in terms of how they structure social life? And how are these variations connected back to more basic psychological motives? Kind of like the fundamental motives that we talked about at the very beginning of our course. So specifically, the framework that we're going to be discussing is one that was developed by this guy named Geert Hofstede. So Hofstede is a Dutch researcher, and early in his career, he had actually started out, interestingly enough, as an engineer. But he entered the business world, ended up transitioning to being a management trainer, and eventually managed IBM's personnel research department. And so as part of this job, he was in charge of administering psychological surveys on an annual basis to IBM employees across not just one office, but different subsidiaries, different branch offices across the entire globe. And in large part, these surveys had to do with really basic psychological things. Things like the kind of values you endorsed. And so what he ended up with is this really massive survey database after many years of going through this process. It's not originally what it was intended for, but Geert realized that there was this uniquely valuable opportunity to look at cross-cultural variation, because he was the one person in the world who was able to, kind of at a moment's notice, suddenly have access to data from 100,000 different people from more than 50 different countries, but all working in similar circumstances. Now, I want to note, these were not just surveys of IBM executives or IBM managers. These were surveys administered across lots of different levels of the organization. So even though it's restricted to just one company, it's not restricted to one age group or gender or socioeconomic status. And so when Geert had this insight that he had this sort of uniquely valuable set of data, again, even though that's not what it was originally intended for, the approach he took is to try to understand variation at the country level. And once you found different items, different specific questions in these questionnaires that were higher in one country, tended to be lower in another, maybe more in the middle in this other country, he tried to understand what kinds of questions clustered together. So if you say that you really value family life, is that going to correlate with saying you really value leisure time? If you say you have a preference for order, are you also going to say that you really care about respecting tradition? Things like that. So what are these related clusters of questions that emerge from the data? And he eventually landed on 6 that explained a lot of the different variation across different cultures. And so these are the 6 dimensions that Hofstede identified. And the first we've talked about in quite a bit of detail already. This is the distinction between individualism and collectivism, which really has to do with the tension between individuals and groups. Obviously, to work most effectively, to survive even, we have to be members of groups. But to some extent, that means suppressing our individual needs and desires. So, do you prioritize group interest over self-interest, or vice versa? The second dimension is power distance. And this has a lot to do with another common theme of our course, which is status and hierarchy. So specifically, is a culture very comfortable with hierarchy? Does it take it as a basic fact of life? Or does it strive for a more equal, egalitarian structure? The third dimension is masculinity-femininity. And this probably sounds a little bit weird right off the bat. This is not referring to individual personality traits of masculinity or femininity, but rather a culture's overall focus on stereotypically masculine domains like achievement and work, or more stereotypically feminine values like nurturance and care and family. The next dimension is something called uncertainty avoidance. And this has to do with the fact that we live in a world that will always have some ambiguity and some uncertainty. This causes stress, right? This causes maybe a sense of helplessness or a lack of control. So how do you deal with this? Some cultures lean into the uncertainty and embrace it. Some try to fight it. Long-term orientation, which is sort of similar in the sense that it's looking towards the future. But it's really about whether a culture kind of roots itself more so in heritage and past traditions, or whether it's trying to be very agile, progressive, flexible, in order to best adapt to a changing future. And finally, indulgence-restraint, which has to do with the fact that we have basic impulses. We enjoy, eating and drinking, pleasureful activities, leisure. But if we just did those things all the time, society would kind of fall apart. So societies have different approaches to how much they encourage people to gratify these impulses or control them. And we're going to talk about each of these dimensions in a lot more detail. So let's start with power distance. Again, this is fundamentally about hierarchy. And this is not just the extent to which people who are on the top of the pyramid are comfortable with hierarchy. In fact, it's actually more so about people who are on the bottom. People in really high power distance countries actually accept this hierarchical order. They see it as natural. It doesn't need further justification. But in societies that are very low in power distance, that are more egalitarian, people are actively striving to equalize distribution of power, and they want to see hierarchies be justified. Okay, so there are some more specific dimensions that are associated with where a society falls on this dimension. In small power distance countries, this is where you're more likely to see this almost like, West Coast, crunchy granola, hippie-style parenting, where kids are given a lot of decision-making and autonomy at even really young ages. Parenting as a negotiation. In large power distance countries, parents are the absolute authority, and they teach children to be obedient. There's also some intersection with how much elders are necessarily respected. Do you have strict age hierarchies? And you can see echoes of this, for instance, in education. So Hofstede identifies a difference between educational systems centered around students actively learning, trying to meet students' needs and personalized education, versus having a lot of focus on the teacher as an authority. And I want you to reflect for a second on where you think you'd expect to see the highest power distance, the most hierarchy, in different countries across the globe. Are there any regions that come to mind? Now, what about low power distance or egalitarianism? Where might you expect to see a lot of that? Okay, so this is a map actually showing higher and lower levels of power distance Brighter red here would indicate a higher power distance, more hierarchical society, and green would represent a more egalitarian society. So the countries that score the very highest on this include Malaysia, Guatemala, Panama, and the Philippines, but in general, this tends to be higher in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe. And it tends to be lowest in English-speaking countries, Scandinavia, and just Northwestern Europe more generally. Now, that splitting of regions might remind you of something. You might not be surprised to learn that power distance tends to be inversely correlated with individualism. So these very same countries, again, English-speaking world tends to be extremely high in individualism, also high in parts of Northwestern Europe and Scandinavia, lower in lots of other places, like South America, Africa, Asia. And this is argued to be partly a product of the fact that both of these variables are themselves correlated with economic development. So richer countries, as a country develops economically, becomes more industrialized, becomes more urban, you tend to see greater individualism. Not because individualism boosts economic productivity, but because economic productivity allows for people to start prioritizing individual needs, individual expression. Greater economic productivity and the growth of a robust middle class and a robust professional class also tends to be associated with people expecting equality and expecting respect from other members of society. So that's where you get this correlation between power distance and individualism. Okay, second dimension, masculinity-femininity. And this is really about a balance between prioritizing achievement and competition versus prioritizing nurturance and care. So countries that are highly quote-unquote masculine tend to have a more assertive, competitive character. And countries that are more quote-unquote feminine tend to value modesty and nurturance. Now, these poles are called masculine and feminine not to essentialize gender, but because these clusters of qualities are kind of well summed up by these stereotypical images that we have of gender. And this dimension is also connected to gender in another really intriguing way, which is that highly masculine countries tend to have stricter divisions between gender roles. This is more like your traditional 1950s breadwinner homemaker model. Women are expected to do one sort of thing and be one sort of way, and men are expected to be another way. The most feminine countries on the planet tend to have a lot more gender equality, with women participating heavily in the workforce and men participating heavily in the domestic and family sphere. And men and women are not expected in these highly feminine countries to have fundamentally different temperaments. So speaking very broadly, the masculinity extreme of this dimension represents a preference in society for achievement, material rewards, and it's probably going to reflect a society that feels more competitive. Highly feminine cultures have a preference for cooperation, modesty, caring for the weak, and also emphasizing quality of life. So do you have any ideas about what parts of the globe might be the most feminine, and other countries that might be more masculine? Okay, so this is what we see. And on this graph, lighter pink colors represent higher degrees of femininity. The darker red, the more masculine. And so femininity is really strongly clustered in Scandinavia and some northwestern European countries like the Netherlands. Masculinity tends to be especially high in Japan, German-speaking countries, and some places with Latin influence like Italy and Mexico. It tends to be kind of medium in a lot of places, including English-speaking countries, including other parts of Europe like France, Spain, Portugal. Okay, uncertainty avoidance really has to do with how a culture deals with the fact that the future can't be known and not everything always makes sense. So do we try to control things, or do we go with the flow? Also has to do with whether or not people feel comfortable in situations that are new or unstructured or unknown, and with people and things that are deviant or unusual. In high uncertainty avoidance cultures, You try to minimize any discomfort with uncertainty by having really strict behavioral codes, strict laws, strict rules, and disapproval of people who are really different or deviant. So some more micro features that this is associated with. Interestingly, these dimensions actually correlate with mental health, things like how stressed people are. The more the cultures are tolerant of ambiguity, the better mental health their citizens tend to have. So where do you think you might see a lot of uncertainty avoidance? What places do you think are actually very comfortable with uncertainty? This is what we see. Higher uncertainty avoidance here is reflected by deeper red colors. And uncertainty avoidance tends to be highest in East and Central European countries, Latin America, Japan, and German-speaking parts of Europe. English-speaking countries, Scandinavian countries, and China tend to be pretty high in comfort with uncertainty. A related dimension is what Hofstede calls long-term orientation. And this has to do with whether a culture is really rooted in the past or trying to anticipate and adapt to the future. So societies that are what we would call short-term oriented, it's a confusing term because it's not really short-term, it's really present and past-oriented cultures, prefer to maintain time-honored traditions, to have stable norms, and change is viewed with a lot of suspicion. Whereas long-term oriented cultures take a much more pragmatic approach, try to save for the future, try to learn and educate for the future, try to be agile and comfortable with change. So maybe think about two different styles of companies, right? Think of like a big traditional corporation that has rules and hierarchies it's always followed, and it's just not going to change. Versus a very small, agile tech company that is constantly rethinking things, constantly trying to innovate in order to prepare for the future. So short-term orientation, again, I know that term is confusing, tends to really focus a lot of conversations, a lot of thought, a lot of emotions have to do with things that have occurred in the past. So be a very wistful, reminiscent culture. Long-term oriented countries tend to be very future-oriented, so don't waste time daydreaming or being nostalgic. Instead, think about your future. So where do you think is likely to be really long-term oriented? Where do you predict might be more short-term oriented? Well, I don't know that this one is always very obvious. The longest term oriented countries. Now we're seeing less data here. This is actually a dimension that Hofstede added a little bit later. So we have valid data from a smaller set of countries. But East Asian countries, and in particular China, tend to be very long-term oriented, very geared towards adapting to the future, followed by Eastern and Central Europe. And we, the United States, as well as Australia, Scandinavia, some other English-speaking countries, Latin America, and lots of African and Middle Eastern countries all tend to be more short-term oriented. So our final dimension here is indulgence and restraint. And this really has to do with how you deal with our basic drives for pleasure and gratification. So highly indulgent countries allow relatively free gratification of these impulses we have to enjoy life and have fun. Eating, drinking, dancing, talking, relaxing, taking time off, really enjoying life. And my little mental image of this would be like having a really wonderful vacation in Italy, where you see how people can have these long, lingering dinners with many glasses of wine and wonderful conversations with friends, and there's a lot less concern about the fact that that might make you tired for work the next day. In contrast, countries that emphasize restraint try to suppress the immediate gratification of these needs and regulate them with stronger social norms, more disapproval, really emphasizing self-control. And here are some of the consequences of this. So interestingly, this is actually really correlated with happiness and life satisfaction. You might think that there are some aspects of self-control and self-restraint that sound healthy, and of course there are, but on balance, highly indulgent countries have more people who say that they're happy, who say they're satisfied with their life. Whereas highly restrained countries almost have this kind of somber feeling to them, where there's more emphasis on negative things and negative memories. So where do you think might be highly indulgent across the globe, and where do you think you might see more restraint? Here's how this shakes out. So indulgence tends to predominate in both South and North America. So Canada, United States, Mexico, Latin America, lots of Western Europe, including Scandinavia, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Whereas Eastern Europe, most of Asia, and the Middle East tend to emphasize more restraint. So what about the United States, which is a country that all of us have at least some experience with? Well, we already know that we are extremely individualistic. We are the record setters for individualism. And you see this reflected in things like the saying, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It turns out, despite the high level of economic inequality in the United States, and of course persisting inequalities in terms of race and gender and so on, we score as a medium to low power distance country. So in some ways, we value egalitarianism, and you can see this in phrases like, all men are created equal. We're actually pretty far out on the masculinity spectrum, and remember that masculinity has both to do with having more traditional gender norms, but also with this preference for assertiveness, competitiveness, and prioritizing work over family life. So think about the workaholic, work-all-the-time culture of the United States. We are sort of medium on the uncertainty avoidance dimension, so if anything, we trend towards being more comfortable with freedom of expression and innovation and ambiguity. But we are low in long-term orientation, which means we are more rooted in the present and the past than in planning carefully for the future. Now, of course, the United States has a reputation as an entrepreneurial country that has a lot of innovation, but if you look at individual people's psychology, it's a little bit more rooted in the idea of living for today. And of course, this goes hand in hand with being pretty high in indulgence. So going for it, having the extra drink, having the double cheeseburger, treating yourself.